There is a name the gods themselves forbade me from speaking. In the fjords of 9th century Norway, where winter lasted 9 months, and the other 3 were merely winter pretending to leave, there lived a people who understood that some knowledge carries a tax on the soul. They called it Gleimska, the forgetting, and they believed it was sacred. Not the kind of forgetting that comes with age or grief, but the kind that swallows entire deities whole. The old priests taught that the world was built on a balance. What the gods remembered, the earth kept. What they chose to forget, the earth buried so deep that even the roots of Yggdrasil could not find it. But here is what the priests never told the children, and what the children never told their children, and what the Viking sagas carefully omitted from every fireside retelling. Forgetting is not passive. Someone has to do it. Someone has to reach into the weave of existence and pull hard until a god's name unravels from every story, every altar, every prayer. And whoever holds that power does not simply forget. They unmake. They carve absence into the architecture of the divine itself. 3 weeks ago, in a village so small it had no name on any map, an old woman with ash in her hair sat me down by a fire that smoked green because the wood was driftwood soaked in salt. She looked at me the way you look at a man who has just walked into a burning house and asked for directions. And then she said the words that would unmake my understanding of the gods forever. The last goddess they erased is still out there, waiting. And the only way to bring her back is to speak the name we were not supposed to know, and none of us know. Not anymore. The fire crackled. Outside, the fjord wind screamed against the turf walls like something trying to get in. And somewhere in the distance, too far, too faint to be sure, I heard singing in a language that died before the first longship ever touched water. The old woman reached into her coat and pulled out a leather pouch, scorched at the edges. My mother gave me this. Her mother gave her. 7 generations this has passed hands. I was too afraid to open it. But you're not from here. You're not protected by the old boundaries. She pressed the pouch into my palm. The leather was warm. It should not have been warm. Why me? I asked. She smiled, and her teeth were black, and her eyes were the color of deep water where light goes to drown. Because you came looking for a story, and this story has been looking for someone to carry it. The question is whether you'll survive the telling. The temple stones still remember. You can hear them breathing in the dark, cold, ancient waiting. And tonight, that someone is you. She stands at the threshold now, her hand trembling over the scorched leather pouch. She thinks she's here to hear a story. She has no idea the story has already begun to hear her. Her name was Sigrun, which means the secret victory, though she had never won anything without losing something equal in return. She was born in the last winter that the old gods still answered when called, before the white robes came with their silent prayers and their god who died on wood and demanded nothing in exchange but faith. Her mother had been a völva, one of the seeresses, who walked between worlds with their iron staffs and their eyes that saw through time like wind through sail. Her father had been a Christian priest, which meant Sigrun grew up speaking 2 languages of the soul and belonging fully to neither. By the time the village had settled into its uneasy truce between the old faith and the new, Sigrun had become something rare, a woman who could read the omens of ravens and the mercy of Christ with equal fluency, which made her useful to everyone and trusted by no one. The Vikings brought her dried fish and asked if the sea would be kind. The monks brought her candles and asked if their manuscripts would survive the journey south. Sigrun took both and gave them answers that were true enough to satisfy and vague enough to protect her. But last night, while sorting through the ashes of her mother's burned shrine, burned not by enemies, but by her own mother, in the final days before she died, Sigrun's hands found something that should not have survived the fire. A manuscript half charred, its edges still warm to the touch. The monks would have called it heresy. The old priests would have called it impossible. Sigrun called it what it was, a door that should have stayed closed. The text was written in a language older than the runes, in ink that smelled of iron and grief. And at its center, repeated 3 times in 3 different scripts, was a name, not written as words are written, but woven, the way threads weave when someone is trying to hide a pattern from those who do not know how to look. Her mother had left a note, barely legible, scratched into the leather binding. She is not gone, only quiet. Quiet is not absence. Quiet is waiting. Who was she? The manuscript trembled in Sigrun's hands. No, the manuscript was trembling because her hands were trembling. Except they weren't. The trembling was coming from the pages themselves, the way a sleeping thing shifts when it senses someone near. The shrine had no name, but the villagers called it Hogfell, the mound that breathes, because the ancient burial mound at its center was said to inhale when the moon was full and exhale when it waned. Sigrun had not visited since her mother's funeral, when she had stood at the mound's edge and thrown handfuls of earth onto the coffin, and said nothing because there was nothing to say that the earth had not already claimed. Now she stood before it again, the manuscript burning against her chest like a second heartbeat, and she understood why her mother had burned everything except the one thing that mattered. The shrine's guardian was old. Not old the way stones are old, though he was that too. His skin so weathered it had become a map of centuries, his eyes 2 chips of glacier ice that had seen the world before the world learned to speak. His name was Bjorn, which meant bear, and he had guarded this place since before Sigrun's grandmother was born, which meant he was either blessed by the old gods or cursed by them, and in the old faith, those were often the same thing. He stood at the entrance to the mound, arms crossed, his staff planted in the earth like a tree that had grown there forever. He did not ask why she had come. He already knew. Guardians always know. "You carry something that burns," he said. His voice was the sound of ice cracking on a frozen lake. Ancient, dangerous, beautiful. "Put it away, or the mound will swallow you before you reach the archive. I need to see what my mother found." Your mother found the same thing her mother found. Her mother before her. 7 generations, a daughter has come here with fire in her hands. And 7 times the archive has asked the same question. He stepped aside, revealing the dark mouth of the passage that led into the living heart of the mound. The question is always the same. The answer is never easy. The air that rose from the passage smelled of roots and rain and something older, the mineral breath of the earth itself, patient and vast. "What is the question?" Sigrun asked. Bjorn looked at her with eyes that held no mercy, only truth. "The archive wants to know what you are willing to forget to remember. Not what you can give. Not what you will trade. What you are willing to become less than you are." Inside the shrine, in the darkness, something shifted. Something that had been waiting. Something that recognized the name woven into the manuscript, and was hungry to hear it spoken aloud. The passage descended in a spiral so gradual that Sigrun could not tell when the stone floor became earth, and when the earth became something older than earth, the bones of the world itself laid bare in the dark. Roots hung from the ceiling like the fingers of drowned giants, and where they touched the walls, the stones sweated moisture that smelled of copper and cold. Her breath made clouds in the air. The deeper she walked, the older the air became, until she was breathing the exhalation of centuries, the lungs of the dead, the silence of stones that had watched the first humans crawl from the sea. She had walked for what felt like hours, when the passage opened into a chamber so vast that her torch could not find its walls. But she could feel them, curved, immense, carved with symbols that moved when she tried to focus on them. The archive. Not a room, but a living thing, a cathedral grown from the earth's own marrow, its shelves carved into the walls themselves, holding not books but memories, the old faith's entire inheritance, pressed into crystal and stone. And in the center of the chamber, seated on a throne of petrified roots, was a figure that was not Bjorn, and was not human, and was not entirely there. It flickered like a candle seen through water, its edges uncertain, its face, if it had a face, turned toward her with the patience of something that had been waiting since before waiting was invented. "Sigrun," it said, and her name echoed in the chamber's throat, repeated by stones that had not spoken in 1,000 years. "Your mother came here. Her mother, before her. The line is old. The dead is older." It rose from the throne, and the roots that formed it groaned as if in pain. "You seek the forgotten goddess. But the archive does not give. The archive only trades. What do you want?" The figure tilted its head, the way a bird tilts its head when watching something it might eat. "Show me the truth you buried. The one you cannot remember. The one that has made you who you are, and the one that will unmake you if it rises." The manuscript in her hands began to glow. Not with fire. With absence. With a hunger that recognized hunger. The archive showed her. Not as words show, not as visions show, the archive became, and Sigrun was inside it, inside the forgetting itself, and the forgetting was not empty. It was full. It was so full that the fullness was indistinguishable from absence, the way a room so crowded with furniture that you cannot see the walls feels empty, feels like nothing, feels like the space where something should be, but has been removed so completely that the removal is the only thing left. She saw the goddess. No, she saw where the goddess had been. A shape in the forgetting, a silhouette of absence, a woman-shaped wound in the fabric of what exists. The old faith had not simply stopped worshipping this deity. They had actively, deliberately, with ritual and sacrifice and a language specifically designed for erasure, removed her from the weave of divine reality. Her name was gone. Her temples were gone. Her symbols, her stories, her altar calls, gone, 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 as if she had never drawn breath in the breath of the gods. But forgetting, Sigrun now understood, was not subtraction. Forgetting was a force, like gravity or grief, and forces do not disappear when ignored. They bend. They pull. They find the cracks in what remains and press against them until the cracks become doors. And the goddess, the erased, the unmade, the forgotten, had been pressing against those cracks for 700 years. I need to tell you something. I need to confess that I am not only telling Sigrun's story. I am also telling mine. I have stood where she stands. I have held what she holds. The manuscript that burns against her chest is the same manuscript that burns against mine. We are both daughters of women who understood that some knowledge must be inherited even when it cannot be understood. And the question I cannot answer, the question that keeps me walking into these dark places, these forgetting places, these graves of gods, is the same question Sigrun will face in the next chamber. What did she do that made them need to forget her? The answer was written on the archive walls in a script that Sigrun did not know, but somehow recognized. It looked like the word for grief. It looked like the word for love. It looked like the word for too much. The goddess had been erased not because she was evil. The erased rarely are. She had been erased because she had loved too much. And that, in the old faith in the divine economy of balances and prices and debts unpaid, was the most dangerous thing a god could do. Remember the manuscript she was forbidden to speak? 3 weeks have passed. Tonight, she finally understands why the goddess fled, not from fear of the gods who erased her, but from grief so vast it would have shattered everything she loved. The archive walls whispered it to her in the dark, in the language she did not know but suddenly, terribly knew. The forgotten goddess's name was not forbidden because she was evil. Her name was forbidden because she was the goddess of sacred forgetting, the divine power that allowed the world to release what could not be held, to grieve what could not be healed, to let the dead rest without being chained to the living by memory alone. She was the one who taught the first humans that some wounds must be opened before they can close. She was the one who whispered to the grieving that their tears were not weakness but water, and water shaped stone. And the old gods had feared her, not because her power was dark, but because it was compassionate, because she offered release where they offered only duty, because she asked the hard question that every grieving heart asks, can I let go? And the gods could not answer, because the gods never grieve. The gods only enforce. The gods only remember. So they erased her. Not destroyed. Erasing is different from destruction. Destruction leaves a hole. Erasing leaves a scar, and scars remember even when the wound forgets. But here is what the gods did not account for. You cannot erase the goddess of forgetting. The act of forgetting her became her act of forgetting. The erasure became her power. She did not flee. She was scattered, her name broken into syllables that lodged themselves in the mouths of children when they forgot their dreams, in the prayers of the grieving when they let go, in the silence between heartbeats when the living remember the dead, and then, gently, mercifully, release them. She was not gone. She was distributed. She was in every act of letting go that the world had ever witnessed. And now, in the archive's heart, Sigrun understood what her mother had known, what her grandmother had known, what every völva in the line had known and could never speak. The forgotten goddess was not a memory. She was a mercy. And mercy, like forgetting, cannot be destroyed. It can only be given. Or refused. The keeper materialized beside her like breath condensing in cold air, not the flickering figure from the throne room, but something older, something that had been waiting at the edge of the archive's consciousness since the first human laid the first body in the first burial mound. It had no face, but it had a voice, and the voice was the sound of wind moving through empty halls, of water finding its way through stone, of the slow, patient work of roots breaking rock. You understand now, it said. But understanding is not the same as knowing, and knowing is not the same as bearing. What did they sacrifice? Sigrun asked. The gods. What did they sacrifice to erase her? The keeper turned what might have been a face toward the archive walls, where the syllables of the forgotten names still pulsed like dying embers. The old faith was built on a covenant. The gods would hold memory, and humans would hold grief. Memory for the divine, grief for the mortal. This was the balance. This was the price of the world continuing. The keeper's voice dropped lower, into registers that Sigrun felt in her chest. But the goddess of sacred forgetting threatened the covenant. She offered to hold grief for the gods. She offered to take from them the one thing they could not bear, the weight of what they had done to the world, the wars they started, the children they sacrificed, the promises they broke. The keeper moved closer, and Sigrun felt the cold of it, not the cold of winter, but the cold of deep water, of the places where light has never reached. The gods could not forgive themselves, so they erased the one who offered to help them forgive. And in erasing her, they broke the covenant. Memory became hoarding. Grief became poison. The dead began to walk because no one was left to help them rest. The living began to forget the living, and the gods began to forget why they were gods at all. The manuscript trembled in her hands. What was her name? The keeper paused. And in that pause, Sigrun heard something she had never heard in all her years of standing between worlds: fear. Her name, the keeper whispered, was the first thing they took, and if you speak it without understanding, it will take the first thing you have. The archive showed her one more thing before the keeper's voice faded into silence. A vision, brief as a candle flame in wind, a woman standing in this same chamber 7 generations ago, holding the same manuscript, wearing the same expression of terrible understanding. The woman looked up, as if she could see across the gulf of years, and Sigrun saw her mother's face. Not as she remembered her from childhood, weathered and worn by the years of hiding, but young, fierce, afraid. The way she must have looked when she first descended into this place, when she first learned what the old faith had done, when she first understood that the goddess of sacred forgetting had been calling to her bloodline for 700 years. Sigrun pressed her hand to the archive wall where the vision had been, and the stone was warm, warm the way skin is warm, the way living things are warm, the way the earth itself remembers what it has buried. Her mother had stood here. Her mother had seen this. Her mother had carried this knowledge like a second skeleton inside her, hidden beneath the ordinary skin of daily life, and had never told her, daughter, because telling would have made Sigrun a target of the gods who erase. For one breath, the weight of it lifted, just slightly, just enough. 7 generations of women, each standing where she stood, each carrying the same impossible knowing, each passing the burden down like an inheritance. No one wanted, but no one could refuse. She was not alone. She had never been alone. Her mother had been with her in every silence, every unanswered question, every night. Sigrun spent staring at the ceiling, wondering why she could never fully belong to either faith. Your mother understood something the others did not, the archive whispered. She did not try to bring the goddess back. She tried to teach the world to grieve. And for 1 generation it almost worked. The micro-milestone arrived softly, her mother's voice, speaking from memory, speaking a truth Sigrun had forgotten she knew. The dead do not want us to carry them forever. The dead want us to learn to set them down. That is the only gift worth giving. That is the only prayer worth praying. The air changed before he did. It began with the smell of wood smoke and summer storms, of apple blossoms rotting in sunlight, of bread baking in a kitchen where someone has just burned their fingers. Then the shadows in the archive's corners began to laugh, not with malevolence, but with the exhausted amusement of someone who has watched the same tragedy play out 7 times and still cannot look away. Loki stepped out of the dark like a man stepping out of a shadow, and he was beautiful in the way that fire is beautiful, in the way that a knife glinting in candlelight is beautiful. Beautiful because you know it will cut, and you want it to anyway. He wore the face of a traveler just in from the road, mud on his boots, a crooked smile, eyes the color of a winter sky right before the sun sets, and the world holds its breath. Sigrun, he said, and her name in his mouth sounded like a secret she had never told anyone. Daughter of the line that carries what no one should carry. I've been watching you since you were 7 years old, and you asked your mother why the moon cried silver. I've been waiting since you first set foot in this mound. He spread his hands, empty, except they were never empty. A trickster's hands are never empty. And between his palms, a thread of light began to spin. You want her name. The forgotten one. The erased. I know it. I've always known it. How? He smiled, and the smile was older than his face, older than the archive, older than the forgetting. Because I was there when they erased her. I watched. I did nothing. I am the god of those who watch and do nothing, and I have been guiltier of that than anyone. The thread of light between his hands became a word, and the word was in a language that made Sigrun's eyes water. Her name is Theta. It means this, not because she was small. Because she was this, she was the goddess of this moment, the goddess of what is, the goddess of grief that cannot be named, because grief, true grief, always belongs to the present, not the past. He held the thread out to her. Take it. Speak it. Bring her back. I will not stop you. I will not even charge you what you think I will charge. His eyes met hers, and for one instant she saw past the trickster's mask to something ancient and tired and unbearably sad. The price is already paid. It was paid 7 generations ago. All you have to do is choose whether the payment was worth it. She stood at the threshold now, the thread of light trembling between them. She thought she was here to find a name. She had no idea the trickster was about to tell her the cost of what she already knew. You feel it too, don't you? The pattern that has no beginning, only a middle that spirals inward toward the center of forgetting. The way the archive walls curve, the way the passages descend, the way every story about this place leads to the same room where the same question waits. 7 daughters. 7 descents. 7 choices made in the dark. And each time the pattern repeats, not because the pattern is evil, but because the pattern is true, because grief is true and forgetting is true, and the space between them is where we have always lived. Loki watched her with the patience of something that has watched oceans form and crumble. The name is not hidden in the archive, he said. The name is in the forgetting itself. To speak it, you must first learn to forget, truly forget, not the way humans forget, which is always half remembering, always the ghost of the thing that was. You must forget the way the goddess forgets. Completely. Totally. Without remainder. How? You already know. You have known since you were a child, and you watched your mother's hands shake when she lit the candles for the old gods. His voice softened, and for one instant he sounded like something other than a trickster. Like a father, maybe, or an uncle who had seen too much and said too little. You forget by grieving. You forget by letting the wound stay open long enough to drain. You forget by standing in the dark and saying, I do not need to understand. I only need to release. The thread of light between his hands pulsed once, twice, like a heartbeat finding its rhythm. The goddess's name is Theta. This. The present. The grief that belongs to now and not to yesterday. She was erased because the gods wanted to live in the past, to control the narrative, to hold the memory of what they had done and never release it. But she knew what they refused to know, that to hold memory without grief is to be crushed by it, that the only way to carry the past is to let it go, over and over, every moment forever. The archive fell silent around them, not the silence of absence, but the silence of attention, the silence of something vast leaning forward to listen. And in that silence, Sigrun heard her mother's voice, not from memory but from the walls themselves. The forgetting is not the enemy. The forgetting is the friend who teaches us when to stop bleeding. The archive answered her. Not with words, the archive had exhausted words long ago. It answered with showing, the way dreams show, the way memory shows, in images that bypass thought and land directly in the soul like rain landing on parched earth. Sigrun saw the world as it had been before the erasing, a world where the gods walked openly, where the boundaries between divine and mortal were thin as spider silk and just as strong, where grief was not a wound but a doorway, and forgetting was not erasure but transformation. In that world she saw the goddess. Theta was not what Sigrun had expected. She was not a queen, not a warrior, not a mother with kind eyes and gentle hands. She was present and not beautiful in any conventional sense, but beautiful the way a storm is beautiful, the way a forest fire is beautiful, the way the moment between sleeping and waking is beautiful. She was there. Completely, utterly, irrevocably there. She existed so fiercely that everything around her seemed dim by comparison, as if she were the only thing in the world that was real, and everything else was merely painted scenery. Her domain was not memory. It was not forgetting. It was the threshold, the liminal space where memory becomes forgetting, and forgetting becomes memory again, where grief releases and holding on meet and greet and part like old friends. She was the goddess of what is happening right now, in this breath, in this heartbeat, in this moment of terrible and beautiful presence. She was the goddess of the fact that existence continues, that even after catastrophe, even after loss, even after the gods themselves break their covenants, the moment still arrives, and we are still here to meet it. The Vikings called it øyeblikket, the eye blink, the instant in which the world opens and closes, and we are briefly, unbearably, magnificently alive within it. The gods had not feared Theta because she was powerful. They had feared her because she made them feel. And the gods, who had lived so long that time had become a texture rather than a flow, had forgotten how to feel without being destroyed by it. The archive pulsed around her, warm now, almost alive, as if welcoming her to a truth it had been waiting 700 years to share. Remember the oath she spoke to the guardian. The threads of her fate are not cut, they are knotted, waiting to be untangled. The Norns came to her in the space between one heartbeat and the next. They did not arrive, they manifested, the way weather manifests, the way seasons manifest, the way the slow, patient turning of the world manifests in the small daily miracles of growth and decay. There were 3 of them, as there had always been 3, as there would always be 3 until the world ended, and even the ending was their design. One wore the face of what was. One wore the face of what will be. One wore no face at all, only a smile that had seen the beginning and the end, and found them both amusing. Daughter of the 7th line, they said in a voice that was 3 voices and 1 voice in the space between voices. You have learned what the forgetting is. Now learn what it costs. They showed her the threads. Not metaphor, actual threads, woven through the archive walls like veins through flesh, each one carrying a color she had no names for, each one connected to a moment in her life she had forgotten or never known. She saw herself at 7, asking her mother why the moon cried silver. She saw herself at 12, hiding in a church while the other children learned to pray. She saw herself at 20, standing over her mother's grave, weeping without knowing why. And she saw something else, threads that did not connect to her past but to her future, threads that reached forward into a darkness she could not see. You are not here by accident, the Norns said. You were born for this chamber, this moment, this choice. But the choice is not what you think. The one with no face leaned close, and her breath smelled of new-mown grass and old bones. The goddess Theta does not need to be remembered. She has never been forgotten, only distributed, scattered. The forgetting did not erase her. It made her. She is in every moment of release, every act of letting go, every time a grieving heart says enough and means it. The 3rd Norn smiled. You were not chosen to bring her back. You were chosen to understand that she never left. Then what is the cost? Sigrun asked, and her voice cracked on the question the way ice cracks on a lake in spring, not breaking but opening, revealing the dark water beneath. Why did my mother burn everything except this manuscript? Why did every völva in my line come to this chamber and leave with something missing? The Norns did not answer. They did not need to. The archive answered for them. It showed her the other daughters. Not visions this time, presences, the way a room remembers a conversation after the speakers have left. She felt them, her mother, standing in this same spot, weeping without tears because she had already wept them years ago, leaving this chamber with a gap in her memory where her first child's face should have been. Her grandmother, who had traded the memory of her wedding night for a single syllable of Theta's name. Her great-grandmother, who had spent an hour in this chamber and emerged unable to remember her mother's face, her mother's voice, her mother's name, the forgetting extracting its price in the currency of connection. 7 daughters. 7 prices paid in the currency of memory. And each one had come here believing they were chosen to restore the goddess, not understanding that restoration was never the point. The cost of speaking Theta's name was not external. It was not sacrifice in the way the old faiths understood sacrifice, blood and bone and the slaughter of beasts. The cost was interior. Every syllable of the goddess's name that Sigrun recovered would replace a syllable of her own life, a memory traded for a memory, a piece of her own story overwritten by the story that had been stolen. She would not lose who she was. She would lose who she had been. And some of those who had beens, she now understood, were the only things keeping her alive. The Norns began to fade, but their voices lingered, 3 tones in a chord that would not resolve. Choose, daughter. The goddess does not need you to speak her name. She needs you to understand why it was taken. And that understanding will cost you something no god can name. The archive waited. The threads pulsed. And Sigrun stood at the center of her own history, knowing that the next breath she took would commit her to a path she could not walk back from. The air shifted. Not dramatically, not the way storms shift or earthquakes shift or the world shifts that the sagas are full of. This was quieter, softer. The way light shifts when a cloud passes and the sun comes through and everything looks, for one breath, the way it looked before anything went wrong. Theta was there. Not fully, not yet, but almost. Present the way dawn is present, before the sun crests the horizon, a lightening at the edges, a warmth that precedes the fire. Sigrun saw her in the grain of the wooden walls, in the pattern of the crystal shelves, in the dust motes drifting through the torchlight like tiny souls remembering how to fly. The goddess was not in the archive. The goddess was the archive, was the act of recording, the impulse to preserve, the grief that transforms memory into story and story into legacy and legacy into the gift we give to those who come after. And in that moment of almost, Sigrun saw what the world had lost when Theta was erased. Not ceremonies. Not altars. Not the grand rituals of the old faith with their blood sacrifices and their chanting priests. What the world had lost was this, the permission to grieve without being healed. The right to weep without knowing why. The grace of holding something precious and broken, and knowing that the breaking was not the end but the beginning of a new kind of holding. For one breath, the goddess's almost presence warmed Sigrun's face, like a mother's hand, brushing a feverish brow. "You are not here to restore me," Theta whispered, and her voice was the voice of every release Sigrun had ever felt. Exhale after crying, the letting go after holding, the quiet that follows the storm. "You are here to remember that restoration was never the point." Sigrun laughed. It surprised her, a laugh in the dark in the archive of forgotten gods, in the belly of the earth where no one had laughed in 700 years. But there it was, a small, defiant, utterly human sound. And in that laugh she found what no god could give her and no forgetting could take. The knowledge that she was still here, still herself, still capable of surprise. The triumph moment arrived softly. "I choose this," Sigrun said, and her voice was steady for the first time since she had entered the mound. "I choose the grief that doesn't demand to be understood. I choose the letting go that doesn't require permission. I choose the moment, this moment, right here, this breath, this heartbeat, as the only altar I will ever need." The child's laughter broke the sacred silence like sunlight breaking through storm clouds, sudden, warm, entirely wrong for the darkness surrounding it. Sigrun stood at the mouth of the mound, blinking against the sudden assault of the living world. She had been underground for 3 days, or 3 hours, or 3 minutes. Time moved strangely in the archive, as if the forgetting itself stretched and compressed duration to suit its purposes. But the world above had continued without her, and now a girl of perhaps 6 years old was running past the mound's entrance, chasing a dog that had stolen something from the cooking fires, and she was laughing the way children laugh when the world is still simple, when forgetting is just forgetting and not a divine weapon. The girl's grandmother sat nearby, watching with eyes that held no recognition of the sacred ground she sat beside. Sigrun recognized her, Gisla, the woman who sold smoked fish at the market, who always seemed tired, who always said her sleep was troubled. The village was full of people like Gisla now. People who slept but did not rest. People who dreamed but did not remember. People who carried grief they could not name and released it in fragments, in small sharp sobs that came without warning, in the middle of ordinary days. The forgotten goddess's absence had not been a catastrophe. It had been a slow hemorrhage. Without Theta's presence in the world, the act of letting go had become corrupted, not gone, but broken, like a river whose source has been dammed. The water still flows, but it flows wrong, pooling in places it shouldn't and drying up in places that need it. You have stopped dreaming deeply. You have noticed it, haven't you? The way sleep feels like forgetting instead of rest. The way you wake with gaps where your subconscious should have been. The way grief surfaces in the middle of ordinary moments, uninvited, unexplained. This is not a modern affliction. This is a 700-year-old wound that is never healed. Gisla looked up and met Sigrun's eyes. "You've been in there," she said. It was not a question. "The old place. My grandmother warned me about it. Said people who go in come out changed." "Changed how?" Gisla shrugged, a gesture that carried 700 years of shrugs, of shudders lifted and dropped in the universal language of "I don't know, and I'm too tired to wonder." Different. Less. More. "I don't remember what the old women used to say." The child ran past again, laughing. And Sigrun understood, finally, what her line had been protecting all along. Not the memory of the goddess, but the capacity to forget, the sacred, necessary, divinely human ability to release without being destroyed by the release. She returned to the archive one final time. Not through the passage Bjorn guarded. That entrance had sealed behind her, as if the mound had decided she had learned enough for one lifetime, or one of 7 lifetimes, or however many the pattern demanded. She returned through the dream gate, the way her mother had taught her, before the forgetting took that memory too. Lie down in a place of power, breathe through the count of 7, and let the earth pull you down into its slow, patient dreaming. The archive knew she was coming. It opened for her like a flower opening for the sun, and the chambers she had walked through days or centuries ago were transformed. No longer dark and silent, but luminous, every crystal shelf glowing with contained light, every carved symbol pulsing with recognition. The forgotten goddess was not just almost present anymore. She was everywhere present, woven through the archive's structure like grain through wood, inseparable from the thing itself. And there, in the final chamber, the chamber she had not known existed until this moment, the chamber that had been waiting for her since before she was born, Sigrun found what 7 generations of völvas had sought and none had found: the name. Written not in runes, not in the old script, not in any alphabet that human mouths had shaped. Written in the language before language, the language of direct knowing, of soul-to-soul communication, of meaning that arrives without the intermediary of words. It was simple. It was so simple it made her want to weep. It was the simplest thing she had ever seen, and the most complex thing she would ever understand. The name was not a word. The name was a gesture, the exact movement a hand makes when releasing something precious into the current of a river. The exact angle of a head when accepting what cannot be changed. The exact shape of a breath when grief finally finds its exit. The micro-milestone arrived quietly. Sigrun's hand moved without her willing it, shaping the gesture in the air, and the archive sang. A single clear note that resonated in her chest, her bones, her blood. And for one breath, she was not Sigrun. She was not a völva's daughter. She was the gesture itself, the release, the letting go made manifest. She understood, finally, why her mother had burned everything except the manuscript. The manuscript was not the answer. The manuscript was the question. And the answer had been inside her all along. She breathed. It was the simplest thing, the most human thing, the most theta thing she could do. Sigrun drew air into her lungs, felt her chest expand, felt the weight of 7 generations lift from her shoulders, and released the name in a single breath. Not spoke, not shouted, not commanded. Released. The way grief is released. The way a bird releases into flight. The way a held breath finally finds its way out after being held too long. The archive shattered. Not violently, not the way things shatter when force is applied. It shattered the way a chrysalis shatters, when the thing inside has finally become what it was always meant to be. The crystal walls dissolved into light. The carved symbols lifted from their surfaces and became free-floating, orbiting the chamber like stars around a new sun. The passages unwound themselves and became a single vast space, and in that space the forgetting gathered itself. 700 years of enforced absence, 700 years of distributed presence, 700 years of theta scattered across every act of release the world had ever witnessed and coalesced. The signature scene arrived like a dream arriving. She rose from the center of the gathered, forgetting like a wave rising from a calm sea. Not beautiful in any way Sigrun had been taught to recognize as divine. Not crowned, not robed, not armored with the symbols of power that gods wear like armor. She was a woman, middle-aged, tired-eyed, her hair the color of winter wheat, her hands rough as if she had been working, her face the face of someone who has wept for 7 centuries and is only now, with this breath, beginning to dry her eyes. Daughter of the line, Theta said, and her voice was Sigrun's mother's voice, and her grandmother's voice, and the voice of every grieving woman who had ever lived and released and lived again. You gave me back my name. I gave you back the gesture, Sigrun said. The name was always yours. The goddess smiled, and it was not a divine smile, not the smile of a being who had conquered forgetting. It was the smile of someone who has finally been seen. And now the world will have to learn to see me too. The light expanded. The archive ended. And Sigrun stood in the dark of the mound's root, holding nothing but air and the memory of a gesture, while somewhere far above, the first dreamer in 700 years slept deeply and woke remembering. Remember what Loki promised in the bargain? The gods are moving now, not to help, but to witness what their forgetting has birthed. Sigrun felt them before she saw them. The air in the mound's root thickened, became viscous, the way air becomes before a thunderstorm, or before the aurora tears the sky open and shows mortals what the heavens really look like. The old pagan Vikings believed that the gods gathered when something unprecedented happened, not to celebrate, not to punish, but to assess. To decide whether the new thing was threat or gift or simply a disruption they would have to accommodate. Their word for it was Dahmer, judgment, but also reckoning, the moment when the scales tilt and the outcome becomes visible. She climbed out of the mound as the sky was turning. The fjord had gone the color of a bruise, purple and gold, and the deep arterial red that sailors learned to read as warning. The air smelled of ozone and approaching snow, and in the distance she could see them, the gods, not as they appeared in the stories the Christian monks now forbade, but as they truly were, vast, ancient, terrible in the original sense of the word, worthy of awe and terror in equal measure. Odin with his single eye that had traded the other for wisdom. Thor with his hammer that bent lightning toward those it chose to strike. Freyja with her necklace of tears and her cloak of falcon feathers. And others, beings whose names the world had forgotten so completely that even forgetting had forgotten them, standing at the edges of the gathering like witnesses at a trial. Loki stood apart from the others, not with them and not against them, in the space that tricksters always occupy, the space of ambiguity, of witness, of the terrible freedom that comes from belonging fully to no side. He met her eyes across the fjord, and his smile was the smile of someone who has just watched a game end and is waiting to see who will claim the board. The question no one would answer hung in the frozen air. Now that the goddess of sacred forgetting has returned, what will the gods do with a power they once tried to destroy? Not dramatically, not with the fanfare of thunderclaps, or the theatrical darkness that gods so often manufacture when they want to remind mortals of their place. She rose the way dawn rises, the way tide rises, the way grief rises when it has been held too long, inevitable, natural, unstoppable. She lifted from the ground at the center of the village, not above it, but through it, as if the earth itself was releasing her, and the air around her shimmered with the accumulated weight of 7 centuries of absence. The gods went silent. Even Odin, who had not been silenced since he traded his eye for a drink from Mimir's well, said nothing. Even Thor, whose hammer had silenced mountains and sea serpents and the arguments of lesser beings for millennia, lowered his hand and waited. Theta did not speak at first. She simply was, present in a way that made the air taste different, made the light bend slightly toward her, made the snow that had begun to fall from the bruised skyland on her shoulders and refused to melt. She was not angry. Sigrun could see that clearly now, could read it in the set of the goddess's shoulders, in the patience of her waiting, in the extraordinary gentleness of her attention. She was not vengeance. She was evidence. The forgotten goddess turned to face the assembled gods, and where her eyes should have been, there was only light, not blinding, not painful, but revealing. Looking into Theta's eyes was like looking into the sky and seeing not stars but the spaces between stars, not darkness but the potential that darkness contains. She raised her hands, and the air filled with images, not projections but memories, memories that belonged to the gods themselves, memories they had tried to forget, memories they had erased a goddess to escape. Sigrun saw the first war between the Aesir and the Vanir, saw the children sacrificed to seal the peace. She saw Odin's bargains with the dead, saw the families he had broken to gain his wisdom. She saw Thor's hammer, forged in the heart of a dying star, its power purchased with the extinction of an entire species of celestial deer. She saw what the gods had done, and she showed it to them, without judgment, without accusation, simply showing, the way Theta had always shown, the truth of the present moment unflinching and unfiltered. The snow kept falling. The gods kept silence. And Sigrun understood what the forgotten goddess had returned to offer, not judgment but witness, not punishment but the simple, devastating gift of being seen. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, so full that Sigrun could feel it pressing against her eardrums, could taste it on her tongue like iron and snow, and something sweeter underneath, something that might have been mercy or might have been the memory of mercy, worn smooth by centuries of handling. The gods stood frozen in their divine attitudes, caught in the act of being witnessed, and Sigrun watched something she would never forget, divinity confronting itself in a mirror it had not known existed. Odin wept, tears that fell as gold and froze before they touched the ground. Thor set his hammer down, slowly, deliberately, the way a man sets down a weapon he has carried so long he forgot it was a choice. Freyja turned away, her falcon cloak becoming a shroud, her necklace of tears suddenly too heavy for her throat. Theta waited. She had shown them what they had done. Now she would wait, for 7 centuries if necessary, for 7,000, for them to decide what to do with what they had seen. And then the cough came. Later, in the aftermath of the divine confrontation, a single cough echoed through the empty shrine, and Sigrun realized she was no longer alone. Not a divine cough, not the thunderous clearing of a godly throat. A human cough, wet and small, the cough of a child who has been holding their breath too long and finally desperately needed to breathe. Sigrun turned and saw the girl from earlier, the one who had been chasing the dog, the one whose laughter had broken the sacred silence of the mound, standing at the edge of the gathered divine, her eyes enormous, her face smeared with fish grease and tears. She had been there the whole time. She had witnessed everything. And now she was coughing, not from fear but from the weight of too much too fast. And Theta, the forgotten goddess, the goddess of sacred forgetting, turned from the assembled gods and looked at the child with something that was not divine and not human, but was the simplest, oldest thing in the world: tenderness. The pattern interrupt arrived with the mundane persistence of life, continuing despite everything. The girl's mother appeared, scooped her up without a word, and carried her toward the village. The dog that had stolen the fish ran behind them, still grinning, still triumphant. And in the space between divine and ordinary, Sigrun understood what the forgotten goddess had always known. The gods would do what the gods would do. But the child would grow, and the child would remember not the gods, but the goddess who had looked at her with human eyes in a divine moment. Odin came to her at the edge of the fjord, where the ice had begun to form in thin crystalline sheets along the shore. He did not appear as the all-father of the stories, resplendent in gold and authority. He came as an old man, a wanderer, a traveler, the kind of figure a Viking might pass on the road without a second glance, which was exactly the point. The one-eyed god understood that true power wears ordinary faces, and ordinary faces do not frighten. Sigrun, he said, and his voice was the creak of leather, the scrape of a whetstone, the sound of a man who has walked too far and slept too little. Daughter of the völva line. I have watched your blood for 7 generations. I watched your mother burn. I watched your grandmother speak words that should not have been spoken. And now I watch you. Watching is not the same as seeing, Sigrun said. Theta taught me that. He smiled, and his smile was old, so old, the smile of someone who had made bargains with the first beings and would make bargains with the last. She taught you many things, but she did not teach you what I have come to offer. He reached into his cloak and withdrew something that made Sigrun's breath stop. A cup, wooden, unremarkable, the kind any farmer might drink from. But the cup held no liquid. It held absence, a darkness so complete that looking at it was like looking at a wound in the world. The forgetting, Odin said, not distributed, not scattered, contained. The cup that held Theta's name before we erased it. One sip and the goddess returns to silence. One sip and the world forgets that anything has changed. The gods keep their secrets. The covenant remains broken. And you return to your village, to your ordinary life, to the small griefs that humans carry and release without divine intervention. Why would you offer me this? He set the cup on the ice between them, and the ice did not crack, because Theta was right. We did not destroy her. We could not. We could only delay. And now she has returned, and we must decide, all of us, gods and humans, alike, whether to live in a world where forgetting is sacred, or a world where forgetting is forbidden. The cup waited. The ice gleamed. And Sigrun understood that the bargain was not about what she would gain. It was about what she was willing to become. Sigrun did not touch the cup. She stood on the ice, the cold seeping through her boots, the snow falling around her in the silence that follows divine confrontation, and she thought about her mother. Not her mother as she had known her, tired, afraid, hiding candles in the root cellar, but her mother as she must have been before, young, fierce, standing in this same place with this same cup before her, making the same choice that was not really a choice at all. Her mother had not drunk from the cup. Her grandmother had not drunk. 7 generations of women had faced this same offer, the offer to return to forgetting, to let the gods keep their secrets, to carry on in a world where grief was a wound and not a doorway. And 7 generations of women had refused. I see the shape of your answer, Odin said. His voice held no anger, no threat. Only the weariness of a god who has lived so long that choices have become predictable, and predictability has become its own kind of prison. You will refuse. The line always refuses. The line refuses because the line remembers, Sigrun said. Not the goddess's name that was taken, but the feeling of her, the shape of the absence she left. Your forgetting did not erase her, All-Father. It made us grieve her without knowing what we grieved. And that grief, that nameless, formless, sacred grief, is what kept us coming back. She stepped closer to the cup. Not to take it, to look into it. The absence inside was seductive, not dark but quiet, a silence so complete it felt like peace. She understood suddenly why her mother had wanted to drink, why any grieving person might want to drink. The cup did not offer oblivion. It offered rest. The rest of not knowing. The rest of not feeling. The rest of letting the gods carry what humans should not have to carry. But that was the lie. The gods could not carry it. That was why they had erased Theta in the first place. The gods had wanted to carry their guilt alone, without the mercy of release, and when release proved impossible alone, they had destroyed the only one who could have helped them. I will not drink, Sigrun said, and I will not ask the world to drink. The world has been thirsty for 700 years. Let it drink now. The cup shattered. The ice held. And somewhere in the gathering dark, the first star appeared, not a star but a goddess, watching, waiting, finally allowed to return. Hermother came to her in the space between the shattered cup and the first light. He did not arrive the way the other gods arrived, with drama, with presence, with the weight of divinity pressing against the air. He arrived the way the dead arrive, quietly, inevitably, with the patience of something that has already happened and cannot be unhappened. He wore the cloak of the underworld, woven from the shadows of failed journeys, and his horse Sleipnir stood beside him, eight-legged, gray as winter mist, its eyes holding the steady calm of a creature that has crossed the bridge Bifrost so many times that the crossing itself has become a memory too heavy to carry. You know who I am, he said. It was not a question. The messenger of the dead, the one who walks between worlds. And you know why I have come. Sigrun nodded. To tell me what she wants. Hermother led her horse forward, and Sigrun followed on foot, and the landscape around them shifted, not geographically but emotionally, as if the fjord and the snow and the gathering dark were merely moods, and the true terrain was the landscape of what remains when the gods have said their piece. They walked through a meadow that smelled of autumn harvest and buried hope. They crossed a river that ran with the tears of mothers who had outlived their children. They climbed a hill that was made entirely of last words, the final syllables spoken before death, preserved in stone and ice in the patient silence of centuries. And at the top of the hill, Theta waited. She was not the radiant presence Sigrun had witnessed in the archive's heart. She was not the exhausted woman with tired eyes. She was something in between, a woman sitting on a stone, looking at a horizon she had not seen in 700 years, her hands folded in her lap, her shoulders curved inward as if holding herself. She wants what she has always wanted, her mother said. Not worship, not power, not even the restoration of her temples and her rights and her place in the divine hierarchy. He paused, and in his pause, Sigrun heard the grief of a god who has carried messages between worlds for so long that he has become the messages themselves. She wants a witness, one person who will remember that she existed. Not a kingdom, not a cult. One name, one story, one small flame in the darkness of forgetting. Sigrun climbed the hill alone. Her mother had returned to his messages, to his endless crossings, to the patient chicken work of carrying words between the living and the dead. That was all he had ever been, and all he would ever be. The hill of last words fell away behind her, and the stone where Theta sat grew larger with each step, until Sigrun could see the details, the worn grooves in the rock, where the goddess's hands had rested, the moss that had grown in the shape of a crown no one had placed there, the way the wind moved around her as if she were the center of a current, the still point around which everything else turned. She sat down beside Theta, not at her feet, not below her, beside, equal to. Two women on a stone, looking at a world that had forgotten how to see them both. I don't know what to say, Sigrun admitted. You don't have to say anything. Theta's voice was the voice of every quiet moment Sigrun had ever experienced. The pause after grief, the space between breaths, the silence that holds more than sound ever could. You came. That's enough. That's all anyone has ever had to do. The signature scene arrived like grief arriving, Sigrun began to weep. Not dramatically, not the cathartic sobs of someone who has found release after long holding. She wept the way the earth weeps when spring comes and the snow finally melts, slowly, quietly, from somewhere so deep that she had not known it existed. She wept for her mother, who had carried this weight alone. For her grandmother, who had burned her altars and kept her silence. For the 7 generations of women who had stood on this hill and faced this goddess, and been strong enough to refuse the cup and weak enough to know they could never be whole. And she wept for Theta, for the goddess who had loved too much and been erased for it, for the divine grief that had waited 700 years for someone to grieve it back. The tears fell on the stone between them, and where they landed something grew, small, tender, unexpected. A flower, white with petals thin as paper and a scent that smelled of childhood memories and buried promises. The forgotten goddess picked it, placed it in Sigrun's hand. "Now you carry me," she said, "not as a burden, as a witness." The world shifted on its axis, and Sigrun felt the forgetting change, not ending, but transforming, becoming something other than absence, becoming presence, becoming the space where something precious used to be, held open by the simple act of remembering that it had been. The world remembered. Not all at once, not the dramatic, instant transformation that the sagas promised when the gods intervened. This remembering was slower, gentler, the way dawn remembers the dark, gradually, reluctantly, with the tender embarrassment of something waking that had hoped to sleep forever. It began in the village, where Gisla, the tired woman who sold smoked fish, who dreamed without resting, sat up in her bed and realized, for the first time in years, that she was not afraid of sleep. It spread to the monks in their scriptorium, who set down their quills and stared at pages they had copied 100 times, and suddenly, mysteriously, understood. It reached the children playing in the snow, who stopped their game and looked up at the sky as if hearing a song they had never been taught, but had always known. And it reached the gods. Sigrun felt them shift, the gathered divine powers who had stood witness since Theta's return, who had watched the confrontation in the bruised sky evening and the bargain on the frozen fjord. Odin removed his patch. Thor set down his hammer for the 2nd time in one night, and this time his hands were not steady but trembling. Freyja turned back toward the gathering, her falcon cloak becoming a gown again, her necklace of tears suddenly not a burden but a gift, the tears she had cried for others, finally allowed to flow. Theta rose from the stone. She did not rise as a goddess rising to reclaim her power. She rose as a woman rising from a long, long sleep, slowly with effort, holding onto Sigrun's arm for support. The flower in Sigrun's hand glowed faintly, a small sun in the winter dark. "They see me," Theta whispered. "After 700 years. They see me." And they did. Sigrun watched the gods look at Theta, not with fear, not with the calculation of beings assessing a threat. They looked at her with the faces of those who have just remembered something they had forgotten they knew. The memory of Theta was not restored like a kingdom restored, not reclaimed like a throne reclaimed. It returned the way breath returns after drowning, the way light returns after eclipse, painful, partial, but real. A god seeing a goddess. A world seeing its grief. A forgetting that had become so familiar it was almost invisible, finally, blessedly, being seen. The awe moment arrived with the weight of centuries lifting. Somewhere in the village below, a child began to hum a tune no one had taught her. The tune was old. The tune was ancient. The tune was the song that Theta had sung before there were words for songs, the melody that existed in the space between memory and forgetting. And the goddess of sacred forgetting, erased and scattered again, and finally witnessed, began to hum along. Sigrun walked back to the village as the first light of dawn touched the fjord. She carried nothing but the flower, white, fragrant, impossible, clutched in her hand like a lantern. The snow had stopped. The gods had dispersed, retreating to their heavens and their hills and their secret places, to reassess and recalculate and do whatever it is that gods do when the world changes beneath them. Theta had remained on the hill, sitting on her stone, watching the sunrise, with the patient attention of someone who has not seen a sunrise in 700 years and intends to remember every detail. The village was waking. Smoke rose from cooking fires. Voices called children in for morning meals. The ordinary world continued its ordinary rhythm, and for the first time in Sigrun's memory, the ordinary felt not like a diminishment but like a gift. The small repeated miracles of waking, eating, speaking, being present in the moment that was actually happening instead of the moment that had passed. She would tell this story. She knew that now. Not in the grand tradition of the Skalds, with their elaborate kennings and their memorized genealogies, but in the way her mother had told stories, quietly, intimately, to whoever would listen, in the spaces between ordinary moments. The forgotten goddess would not return as a temple or a cult or a formalized faith. She would return as a whisper, the whisper that surfaces when someone who has been grieving finally allows themselves to let go, the whisper that says this is permitted, this is holy, this is the oldest prayer we know. But there was a cost. There was always a cost. She felt it in her left hand, a mark that had not been there yesterday, a small symbol burned into her palm like a brand. It was the gesture, the shape of the release, the name that was, not a word. She would carry it forever, and everyone who saw it would know. This woman has touched the forgetting. This woman has been marked by the goddess who was erased. And Loki's debt? The trickster had not appeared to collect. He would not collect today, or tomorrow, or in a month. But he would collect. The old stories always remembered the trickster's bargains, even when they forgot everything else. The new forgetting had begun. And somewhere in the space between what the world remembered and what it chose to release, a story started that would not end, not in Sigrun's lifetime, not in her children's lifetimes, but in the slow, patient spreading of a truth too simple to destroy. Sometimes, the only way forward is to let go. The fjord wind stirred her hair. The flower in her hand glowed faintly in the dawn light. And Sigrun, daughter of the Völva line, keeper of the forbidden name, walked home.